Okay, let's dive right in. Welcome to this Week 1 Explainer. Today, we're building your mental scaffolding for understanding exactly how complex projects are successfully managed, literally from day one all the way across the finish line. Whether you're managing the construction of a massive new hospital or rolling out a major software update, the foundations we're talking about today are going to be your absolute blueprint for success. So settle in, because what we cover today is kind of going to change how you look at every single project you tackle from here on out. But before we lay out the roadmap, I want you to consider a pretty critical question. Think about the total chaos of unmanaged projects. We've all seen them, right? The missed deadlines, the blown budgets, the frustrated teams, the unhappy clients. So why does this happen so often? Well, it happens because without a structured framework, projects inevitably fall victim to shifting expectations and unpredictable environments. A rigorous project management framework is the ultimate antidote to all that chaos. It provides the strict discipline required to actually turn an ambitious idea into a concrete reality. To demystify the mechanics of project management today, here is our path ahead. 1. The Project Balancing Act. 2. The Project Lifecycle. 3. The power of PM&E. 4. Core components of PM&E. And 5. Driving continuous improvement. Section 1. The Project Balancing Act. To really understand how a project breathes and moves, we have to start with the fundamental physics of project management. There's this core tension inherent in absolutely any project you'll ever work on. And this brings us to a massively important concept, the triple constraint. This is the incredibly delicate balance between a project's scope, its time or schedule, and its cost or resources. Think of it like an equilateral triangle. Each side depends entirely on the others to maintain its shape. If one factor, let's say the construction schedule for that new hospital wing, expands because of some unforeseen problem, well, that delicate balance is completely thrown off. To keep the project viable, you're forced to make adjustments to the cost, maybe by paying for overtime, or you actually have to reduce the scope of the work itself. The reality of project changes is totally unavoidable. If you expand the scope, time and cost literally must follow. You can't magically do more work in the exact same amount of time with the exact same budget. As you're managing your project, you've got to remember that prioritizing these constraints requires valid reasons, simply because changes play absolute havoc with your initial requirements and baselines. Every single decision is a trade-off. Now, this balancing act doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires a constant, dynamic dialogue to manage the expectations of the people who care deeply about the project's outcomes, your stakeholders. We're talking about your project sponsor, your team members, the end customers, and external partners, and they all have totally different priorities. The sponsor might care most about the budget, while the customer cares most about the scope and the quality. Your job as a project manager is to build consensus, resolve conflict, and manage all these diverse expectations around that triple constraint model. Section 2. The Project Lifecycle. So now that we understand that fundamental balancing act, let's look at the actual roadmap, the timeline over which these constraints are actively managed. Projects aren't just random bursts of activity, right? They're structured, sequential journeys with 5 key phases. First up is initiation, where the project is officially authorized. Then, planning, where you clearly define the scope and schedule. Next is execution, where you actually do the work. Overarching all of this is monitoring and controlling, where you're actively tracking progress. And finally, closure, where you finalize all activities and capture lessons learned. Whether you are breaking ground on a hospital or coding a software update, you are going to follow these exact phases. But here's the thing. The reality of how these phases actually interact isn't just some straight, perfectly clean line. Taking a 100,000-foot view, you quickly realize how these phases loop together. Execution, checking outcomes, and making plan corrections function as a continuous, iterative cycle. You plan, you execute, you check your progress, you update the plan, and you execute again. It is a highly, highly dynamic environment. Section 3. The power of PM&E. Okay, so we have a detailed plan, and we understand our life cycle timeline. But how do we know if we're actually on track to deliver value? Planning, monitoring, and evaluation, or PM&E for short, is basically your steering wheel and your dashboard. Let's clarify the difference between the two main tracking components here. Monitoring is a routine, ongoing process. It's like checking your dashboard mid-trip to ensure you have enough gas and are staying in your lane. Evaluation, on the other hand, is the post-trip mechanics assessment. It's a structured, highly objective assessment of the project's design and overall results to determine relevance, performance, and long-term success. Now, evaluations can take on a lot of different flavors. Thinking about the concept of the evaluation star, we see that assessments can be triggered by vastly different needs. On one end of the spectrum, you might have an internal self-evaluation focused purely on learning and improving your own team's processes. On the total opposite extreme, you might have a strict external evaluation triggered by an outside donor or a government agency, focused entirely on accountability and ensuring funds were actually used properly. Both are highly valuable, but they serve very, very different purposes. Section 4, Core Components of PM&E. Let's look at how this builds into practical application on the ground. We need to break down the actual nuts and bolts of how PM&E works to keep your project aligned with its goals. Effective PM&E doesn't just happen by accident. It requires a really systematic approach. First, you need rigorous data collection and validation, gathering high-quality data and verifying that it's actually accurate. Then comes data management and analysis, where you store and synthesize that data. Next is reporting and communication, where you turn raw numbers into actionable reports for decision makers. And finally, stakeholder engagement and action, where you're constantly engaging the people involved to gather feedback and adjust your course. The absolutely crucial point here is that PM&E is not just about spreadsheets and sterile data. When done correctly, particularly in public sector or development projects, it has a profound human impact. Participatory PM&E actually gives a very real voice to local needs, priorities, and aspirations. It builds local capacity and gives your stakeholders genuine ownership over the project's direction. It literally transforms them from passive observers into active, engaged partners. This entire philosophy is perfectly reinforced by the United Nations Development Program. They point out that effective PM&E provides the critical, undeniable evidence needed to fine-tune operations. Without it, it's absolutely impossible to judge if your work is heading in the right direction or if your resources are genuinely delivering real value to the people who need it the most. Section 5. Driving Continuous Improvement. And that brings us to the ultimate philosophy behind all these frameworks, life cycles, and data points we've been talking about. P&M is not just some tedious tool for tracking budgets or checking off compliance boxes. It is a vital mechanism to institutionalize a culture of continuous learning. The fourfold purpose of P&M is exactly this: to build your team's capacity to reflect on problems and actually solve them, to learn, adjust, and take prompt corrective action when things go off the rails, to provide transparent accountability to all stakeholders, and, importantly, to celebrate and build upon the things that are actually working well. As you step into the role of a project manager, or maybe you're refining your current skills, you absolutely must remember that success isn't just checking off a list of tasks and walking away. Real success is about constantly evaluating your performance to maximize the value proposition for the entire organization and the community you're serving. It's about ensuring the work you do today leaves a strong foundation of knowledge for the projects of tomorrow. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. Now that you know the blueprint, the life cycle, and the true power of PM&E, how are you going to use it? Are you going to use these frameworks just to mindlessly check boxes on a schedule to keep your boss happy? Or will you embrace PM&E as the powerful engine it truly is, using it to create lasting value, drive continuous improvement, and ensure your projects actually matter? The choice is entirely yours. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.